Good evening and welcome to this special UKFPO webinar to celebrate 20 years of the UK Foundation Programme. I'm Dr. Mike Masding. I'm National Clinical Director of the UKFPO, and I'm going to be talking on this webinar together with Professor Tom Yapp, who's Foundation School Director in Wales and until recently was the recruitment lead for the UKFPO. I'm afraid I don't have any party poppers or birthday cake to share, just our thoughts on 20 years of the Foundation Programme, which I hope you will find interesting and stimulating. There'll be the opportunity to ask us questions if you want to put those into the question and answer bit on your Teams, and Tom and I will answer those at the end. Both of us have been involved with the Foundation Programme since it started, originally as training programme directors in our hospitals, then Foundation School Directors in our regions, and more recently working with the fantastic UKFPO team on a national level. At this point, I would like to sincerely thank all of the senior leaders who have made the Foundation Programme what it is over the last 20 years, all of the members of the UKFPO team who've worked extremely hard to ensure that the Foundation Programme works, the Foundation School Directors and their teams, and of course all of the Foundation Programme doctors and their supervisors over the last 2 decades. It gives me great pleasure to celebrate 20 years of the Foundation Programme and all that we have achieved in helping young doctors to make the transition from medical school into professional practice, instilling in them the values and behaviours that are important for all doctors and helping them to go on and have successful and fulfilling medical careers. I'm going to speak for a few minutes on how our profession came to the development of the Foundation Programme, which started in 2005. And Tom is then going to talk about the allocation process and how we get Foundation Programme doctors into their programmes. And after that, I'm going to discuss the curriculum we've developed over many years and bring in some thoughts about how the Foundation Programme may continue to develop. So why is the history of the Foundation Programme important? Well, I think it's fair to say that looking at the world today, global society has not really learnt from history, and perhaps that's human nature or perhaps it's deliberate. But as a medical educator, I think it's really important that we reflect on how the Foundation Programme came about, learn from the good things we've done, and the mistakes we have made in order to ensure that the Foundation Programme continues to evolve. So I'm going to go back to 1944 when, to be fair, there was lots of other things that were very important going on. The medical profession of the day must have been confident enough of victory in the Second World War for them to contemplate how medical training could be improved. Prior to the Good Enough report, doctors had come out of medical school and were allowed to practice independently straight away without any supervision and in any specialty. This report suggested that every UK medical student, after passing finals, should complete a 12-month period of appointments in hospital before proceeding to further training in postgraduate medicine. And this became the postgraduate house officer year, which both Tom and I did. Here's the evidence for my PRHO year. You can tell it's a long time ago because I had some hair. I was using a landline because there were no mobile phones, and I was wearing a white coat. This was a time when new doctors would have had 6 months in medicine as a pre-registration house officer and 6 months in surgery. Consultants would have signed us off as being sufficiently competent to proceed to full GMC registration, despite, to be honest, minimal contact with us and no observation of our interaction with patients, or indeed probably in many cases with other healthcare professionals. It's very important that we don't look back at these times with rose-coloured spectacles and imagine it was an amazing time. I certainly got lots of clinical experience, saw lots of patients, but I was working largely unsupervised. There was no record of evidence of my competency or otherwise, and I had very little career advice. It's my belief that there's never been a golden age of medical education, but hopefully since the very early 90s when I was a PRHO, things have moved on for the better. Just to illustrate some of this, well, I think it's fair to say that these are comments that I've heard from F1 doctors over many years. But in fact, they were the complaints of pre-registration house officers from the mid-1960s, before many in the audience were even born. As we moved on, further research shows things that F1s currently may, in some cases, justifiably complain about, particularly workload pressure. But again, this was my generation. A year before I was a PRHO, this was published. And so it just goes to show that many of the issues around being a new doctor are old and not new. In 1997, the GMC published the first formal framework for what pre-registration doctors should be doing in order to get full registration. However, there was still no formal assessment of competence, no formal supervision, and no formal career advice. By the early 2000s, there had been significant reform of postgraduate medical education, with the registrar grades being rationalised, simplified, and probably made better through the work of the CMO at the time, Sir Kenneth Cowman, who became a verb, Cowmanisation. However, the SHO years were still unplanned, with no formal curriculum or supervision, and some SHOs would be at that grade for many, many years, sometimes more than a decade, whilst waiting to get into specialty training, especially those who were trying to get into very popular specialties. The Chief Medical Officer at the time, in 2002, Sir Liam Donaldson, wrote a report called Unfinished Business about the SHO grade. As a result of this report, the notorious modernising medical careers became a much wider reaching and fundamental reorganisation of postgraduate medical training. For the sake of brevity and possibly sanity, I will focus only on the foundation programme rather than the wider reaching circumstances of modernising medical careers. But I think it's fair to say that if you were to read Unfinished Business in 2025 and look at the proposals that were originally planned around modification of the SHO grade, it's really quite difficult to disagree with most of that. A 2-year foundation programme of general training was proposed to develop the core generic skills essential for all doctors, such as teamwork, leadership, professional behaviour, and communication with patients, their families and carers, and communication with colleagues from all disciplines. It was felt very important that foundation doctors experience multiple different specialties rather than just doing 6 months of medicine and 6 months of surgery, and also to gain more experience in looking after the acutely ill patient. And these were the main things that were focused on when the foundation programme was instigated in August 2005. The first cohorts of doctors, foundation doctors, started across the UK at that point, although there had been some small-scale pilots in the preceding years. There was the introduction of educational supervisors, senior doctors, to oversee the training of foundation doctor throughout their 2-year programme. I've named clinical supervisors, someone to oversee their training in any particular post. There was a portfolio, which was originally paper-based, with a great big lever arch file. As a TPD at my hospital, I used to have to go around and get it from every foundation doctor when I wanted to review them and read through it if I wanted to know what they were doing. For the first time, there was a formal programme of workplace-based assessment through what we now call supervising learning events, mini CEXs, case-based discussions, DOPS, all of those things that you'll be very familiar with now in our current postgraduate medical education environment. But prior to 2005 had not been introduced in any formal way in any training programme in the UK. So it certainly felt all very new at that time. 5 years later, the foundation programme was formally evaluated, led by Professor John Collins, a surgeon from New Zealand, leading to this report, Foundation for Excellence. It showed that there were lots of strengths of the foundation programme, in that it was consistent throughout the whole country rather than being based on what opportunities might be had in a particular location. It was felt that the development of the faculty, in particular educational and named supervisors, was really important. It was helpful to have a national curriculum with formal assessments of foundation doctors and a real emphasis on patient safety, and also the safety of the foundation doctors themselves. And rather than just medicine and surgery as traditional, it was felt that the exposure of foundation doctors to a range of different specialties was really a good thing in broadening their experience. However, it was clear that further change was necessary as the foundation programme would continue to evolve. There was some confusion about the role of the foundation doctor, with many F2 doctors still on old SHO rotas and often being expected to do things that were probably too complex for their level of experience and seniority. A generally accepted purpose of the foundation programme was still not quite clearly articulated and understood by all. The provision of career advice was inadequate, and the distribution of placements across specialties did not really reflect the future needs of the NHS, with at the time of the Collins report still around 40% of F1 posts being in medicine and about 40% in F2, and a big chunk, nearly 50% of F2 posts being in emergency medicine, with not enough posts in primary and community care, despite the need for there being more doctors there. The assessment of foundation doctors was felt to be excessive, with no particular clear aim. If we were to reflect on this, what would we say now in 2025? Well, certainly in the 2021 curriculum, the aims of the foundation programme were well articulated, but I think it's fair to say that many of these other issues continue to some extent, although the burden of assessment has been significantly reduced. The next major review of the foundation programme came in 2018, led by Health Education England, building on what had been said in the Collins report. These came up with a number of changes which hopefully become more mainstream in England and increasingly widespread in the other UK nations, such as clear definitions of what different supervisors do, the shadowing and induction week becoming business as usual and often longer than a week, and self-development time, giving foundation doctors the opportunity to develop their own skills. March 2020, and the whole world changed with the COVID-19 pandemic. The NHS and our medical profession had never dealt with anything like this, and at the time it was felt that there was a huge need for medical staff in much greater numbers than was currently there. We all worked closely and at speed to graduate UK medical students quicker, and introduced the interim FY1 grade, who were paid to work as F1 doctors, but with even closer supervision than normal. This scheme was highly successful, was well regarded by all, and it's to the enormous credit of foundation doctors of the time and their supervisors that they were so able to be flexible and to adapt to the changes that came with COVID-19. The pandemic taught us that generalism is very important for the National Health Service, and whilst there will always be a need for specialists, our increasingly elderly and multimorbid population requires doctors with a broad base of skills. We should all be clear that the foundation programme is a generalist programme, is broad-based, and is giving foundation doctors the skills that all of them will need as they move forward in whatever specialty they choose to do. The first cohort of foundation doctors, who started in August 2005, in the main will now be well into their second decade of being senior doctors. And 20 years on from the start of the foundation programme, history tells us that we must ensure that the foundation programme continues to evolve, and we're not quite there yet. But I'm proud that we continue to work to the principles that Goodenough came up with in over 80 years ago, as stated here. We continue to have a consistent nationwide UK generalist programme, helping our new doctors to make the transition from medical student to doctor and develop the clinical skills and professional skills that they'll need throughout their careers. Part of the work of the UKFPO is to ensure that all areas of the UK have foundation doctors through our allocation processes. And Tom is now going to talk about those allocation processes and how they have evolved over the last few years.
Thank you, Mike. Noswaith Pawel, Good evening, everybody. As Mike says, my name's Tom Yapp, and I'm the Foundation School Director in Wales, and have been involved in recruitment to the Foundation programme since the very early days through participation in what was first known as the Rules Group, which then changed into the Recruitment Delivery Group, and now is the Foundation Recruitment Group. I shall share my slides. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that. It's often said that there's more to the UKFPO than recruitment, but in fact, recruitment does play a very large part in our day-to-day work. And it has to be remembered that actually we're often dealing with over 10,000 applicants with a team of around about 10 people. So there's a lot of work for not many people. And as Mike says, we're very grateful to everyone's efforts over that time. I think we have been at the forefront of modernising recruitment into medicine. I think some of what we've done has worked well, some of it hasn't worked quite so well, and there have been many lessons to be learned as we've gone along. But we'll take you on this journey from over the last 20 years. Oh, hang on, I think I need to share that one. So, as with everything, you have to be aware that there are unintended consequences of what we do, and one must always expect the unexpected. And as I said, we're going to cover some of the things we've done and some of the things that have happened as a result of that. 20 years of the Foundation programme, as Mike says, going back to modernising medical careers in 2003. And the first lesson to be learnt is actually using an acronym which is relevant to your programme. So we were never involved in MTAS, which had quite a bad reputation. So medical training application service, whereas we were the Foundation Programme application system. So people often said, tarred us with the same brush as MTAS, but in fact, we were never MTAS, we were always FPAS and then on to newer versions. It's always good to have pictures, and there's Mike in 2004, myself in 2003, around the time of modernising medical careers, teaching, old docs, new tricks. Here we go. So lessons learned. So it's always good. We encourage our foundation doctors to reflect on their practice, and I've reflected on our practice and tried to come up with some themes that we've learned along the way. So the Cure may have always had Friday on their mind, but Fridays are not good days to announce results of allocation processes. And we used to try and get all the work done in the week building up to a Friday and then release them on a Friday. Friday is not a good day for picking up the pieces of people finding out their allocation. And also times, we often used to try and work through the day to get it done, released on that day. Again, that meant results were often released at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. Again, that's not a good time to support people who may have some questions relating to the outcome. So with time, we've been able to move that forward in the working week and also in the working day. So we try to get people have access to results in the sort of early hours of the working day, maybe 8 o'clock before people turn up to work at 9 o'clock. So dates and times. So when we started with the national recruitment process, we had white space questions, and because we're very keen to reflect that actually there's a good work-life balance and people are well-rounded individuals, we explored academic and non-academic achievement, which was interesting because it meant that you then had white space questions about academic and non-academic achievement, and we had to somehow score that so that then applicants could be given a total score and a rank within their cohort. The early days of marking was done in pairs in great big rooms organised by foundation schools, and although we were able to give some guidance, it wasn't until a scoring matrix was developed that we realized that there was a way of adding some consistency to the process. Non-academic achievement, we all have our memories of people's non-academic achievement. and being able to breed zebrafish or doing a forward roll were some of the things that many of us remember from our scoring days. We realized that after a while that non-academic achievement was such a broad church, we realized that it was no longer a useful addition to the white paper questions, and so we moved to academic alone. Alongside that, people were able to demonstrate their achievements with prizes, presentations, and publications. And we also added additional degrees to what was eventually known as additional educational achievements. We had verification days is deeply ingrained on those people who attended, often a trip up to London for everybody in a very relatively small room. And again, we had to work our way through a large number of submissions and therefore assessing whether they were suitable for extra points. With time, prizes and presentations disappeared off the radar, and we were left with publications, which we were able to confirm with a PubMed ID, and then additional degrees. However, it is clear that actually applicant behaviour meant that people realised that if you could get points for additional degrees, maybe the cost of a intercalated BSc might be of value when you came to applying for the foundation program. And of course, not everybody could afford that, and so eventually we realized that perhaps this was an unlevel playing field, and these were removed from the process a few years ago. In 2011, a large piece of work was carried out through Medical Schools Council called Improving Selection to the Foundation Programme, and they did. It's a vast piece of work. It's quite an interesting read if you want to see what the options were, but eventually it came down with the idea that a better way of allocating applicants to the foundation programme would be to run a situational judgment test, an SJT, measuring attitudes and behaviours, and an educational performance measurement, which related to an applicant's performance in their cohort at that medical school. And that was applied to initially quartiles, but then deciles. So people would get a range of points over a 10-point scale in addition to other marks. The situational judgment test was developed with the work psychology group, and many thanks to them for the work that they did. The questions were written and tried and tested, and introduced to Foundation Programme 2013 recruitment. Initially, it was on a paper format before moving to a digital platform, and it was very much along the lines of it was invigilated very much along the lines of a university examination, and applicants could apply for reasonable adjustments. In the end, reasonable adjustments were actually applied, were at least a tenth of the 10% of the cohort were applying for reasonable adjustments. So quite a considerable piece of work to undertake. As Mike said, we had the foundation program review in 2018, and that came up with a suggestion that actually there might be other programs that you might want to recruit to alongside the standard foundation program. And the special foundation programs were the academic foundation programs, which had been running for some time, but then became known as specialized foundation programs. There's still some mystery as to how that word arrived, who came up with the word specialized, but it is still there. We also have priority programs in generally hard to recruit to areas, and that the idea was that those programs could offer incentives for people to apply to those programs, and these include financial incentives, educational incentives, and additional activities. And for a short while, we also had the Psychiatry Foundation fellowships, where people would have quite an in-depth embedding into psychiatry with the help of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. This has sort of fallen by the wayside in recent years. Special circumstances, pre-allocation and inter-foundation school transfers. So there are people who are at medical school and then moving on to the foundation program who have a number of reasons why they need to be in a certain location for their undergraduate or their primary medical qualification and then their foundation program. Initially, these were called special circumstances. It's now the process is now known as pre-allocation, and those principles now apply to people who apply for an inter-foundation school transfer. It's always a difficult area because many people believe that they need to be somewhere, but that actually it relates to a want to be somewhere. And for everybody who is pre-allocated, it means that there is one less opportunity for people to be allocated to that school or region through the standard foundation program allocation process. So it's an area that continues to be challenging. Last year we had about 12% of the whole cohort apply for pre-allocation, which it makes it sound as if many of those cannot be special circumstances given the large number of people involved. We also run an F2 standalone recruitment relating to a legal case known as the Capanova case in 2014. It allows principally international medical graduates with full registration to apply for any vacant F2 posts across the country. It's centrally run, and again, we now use a situational judgment test as a way to long list, and then we offer interviews for those people. A large piece of work, which very grateful to all the people in the various schools who continue to help with that. As Mike said, the COVID pandemic was very challenging for all sorts of reasons. And one of the unintended consequences was that actually when we were looking at the delivery of the situational judgment, which up until that date was a paper-based exercise, as I said, very similar to an invigilated university exam, we'd already made the decision to move to a digital platform, which actually meant that recruitment in 2020 to FP 2021 could actually take part because it was all done on a digital platform through Pearson View Centres or the online the OnView service, and so it would have been impossible to have carried out large-scale exam get-togethers. So one of the unintended consequences of the move was actually we could continue during the COVID pandemic. Algorithms. So there's always been an algorithm for allocating people to the foundation program and their posts. There's the so-called meritocratic, which is based on a preference and a person's performance, or what was previously known as a greedy algorithm. In the early days of the allocation process, we did allocate by preference rather than by score. That moved over to the meritocratic system, and then we've moved back to preference-informed allocation. So this didn't come from the foundation, the UK Foundation Programme. It was actually put forward by interested parties within the undergraduate community and very much supported by medical schools. So it's not a random allocation, it's a preference-informed allocation. And then if there is competition for your preference, then that's the allocation is based on a computer-generated ranking, which in itself is a random number. But so slightly different. First proposed at DMEC in 2021. There was a large stakeholder engagement in 2023. The return of that was that actually 2/3 were in favour, 1/3 weren't. You can't please all the people all the time. So it was then introduced for FP 2024, and we are now in our third cycle of preference-informed allocation and computer-generated ranking. The other thing we have to stress is that we do have an English language proficiency requirement, and in the past it was based on the Dean's statement. It's now based on a cut-off score within those assessments, commercially available assessments. It's actually important to stress that it is slightly different to the GMC requirements, but obviously there's a huge importance placed on the ability to communicate, and obviously the period of transition from student to doctor is also another key step. So we do apply a slightly higher English language proficiency requirement within our recruitment process. Numbers. So if you think back to the 2005, there were less than 7,000 people in the system, eligible people in the system, and whereas last year we had over 11,000 eligible people apply for the foundation program. So a considerable increase of over 50% in eligible applicants. The majority of that increase has actually come out of UK medical school expansion. The number of international medical graduates applying for and being eligible for the programme has remained fairly constant in the last few years. So we have always been oversubscribed for at least 17 of the 20 years of the foundation programme. In the very early days, we were undersubscribed at allocation. However, at allocation, we're oversubscribed, but by the time we start the programs in August, most foundation schools will have vacancies and are therefore undersubscribed. And this relates to withdrawals, either from UK medical graduates, generally being withdrawn by their failure to obtain a primary medical qualification in that recruitment year, or by international medical graduates who withdraw often because they have an offer of a post within their host country. People always talk about preference, and it's very important that people get their preferences. If we were to allocate people by to meet everyone's preference, first preference foundation school, we would have to change the size of the foundation schools considerably, and London would move from just over 1,000 foundation programs to requiring 3,000 foundation programs, and other schools would have to shrink dramatically. And yet, we are obviously providing foundation doctors to locations to provide care to the patients of those communities. So it's always difficult to know, how people will perceive things. People often ask, what's my best way of getting what I want? And it's often said that if you play a game, you will expect to win or lose or possibly draw. Medics by their very nature are competitive, and we do understand that people do want to be in certain locations. But as Mike and I have both said, it's important to understand that the foundation programme is available all over the country, and it provides care to patients all over the country. So ultimately, what is the measure of success when you come to recruitment? Is it people getting what they wanted at the time of allocation, or is it people having a good foundation experience at the end of the 2-year programme? I'm preparing for the future. Obviously, I'm probably not going to be traveling to space or doing whatever that's. What goes around comes around. There's lots of talk about recruitment and how it might change or evolve. It is something. You see things that have been done before, which have disappeared and will come back again. So I won't predict the future, but hopefully we'll be part of that future. And I'd probably like to hand back to Mike for his next presentation.
Thanks very much, Tom, for that really clear and comprehensive look at the foundation programme allocation process, which is a very important part of the work of the UKFPO, but is not all we do at the UKFPO. So what I'm now going to talk about is the foundation programming curriculum, and in particular, how foundation programme doctors learn and develop after they've started as an FY1. I often talk to foundation doctors about the difference between that first Wednesday in August when they started and the end of their F1 year, and just how much they have developed, how much they've learned. And I suspect that if I look back on my career in that first year, we probably learn and develop more than any other 12-month period as a doctor. Now, in talking about the foundation program curriculum, it's important to think about the term curriculum. What does it mean? And I suspect it means lots of things to different people. In particular, what we need to think about is the difference between a curriculum that covers everything that the students do and learn, or in our case, foundation doctors, and a syllabus, which is simply a list of things that they need to learn. I'm going to focus on this concise definition in green: the what, the how, and the why of what our foundation program doctors learn. And first of all, let's focus on the why. What are we trying to achieve in the foundation program curriculum? In the Collins report, which I've already cited, one of the criticisms of the foundation program was that it lacked a clearly articulated and generally accepted purpose. Over the various iterations of the foundation curriculum, we've worked on this. And most recently in the 2021 foundation program curriculum, this is clearly described. It's all about making the transition from medical student to being a doctor, not creating the finished article, about making that transition, taking on all the responsibilities that go with that in terms of looking after patients, about the responsibilities of working with other members of the team, and taking responsibility for their own career development as a professional. In order to achieve this, the purpose of the foundation program is to establish an accountable, capable, and compassionate clinician who are valuable members of the healthcare workforce and are professionally responsible for their own practice and development of their portfolio. And by portfolio, we do mean their e-portfolio, but also their general portfolio of practice. So that's the why of the foundation program curriculum. What about the what? Well, rather than going through various iterations of the syllabus, which is there and has been it has evolved over many iterations, I would like to just focus on the assessment of foundation program doctors as an example of how we have worked on this, as formal assessment was new when the foundation program started and has developed a lot over the past 20 years. The Collins report, quite rightly in my view, said that the assessment of foundation doctors was excessive and onerous. And if you look at the various iterations of the foundation program curriculum, this becomes clear. In 2012, there were 67 separate outcomes in F1 and 67 separate outcomes in F2 that all needed to be assessed in various ways and signed off by the educational supervisor. The 2016 foundation program curriculum reduced this to 20 foundation program professional career capabilities, or FPCs, and these outcomes are broken down into 4 different sections that you can see here. Most recently, the 2021 foundation program curriculum reduced this further to only 3 high-level outcomes with 13 foundation program capabilities. And you will notice that the 3 high-level outcomes were described in the purpose statement of the program. I think this demonstrates how much work has been done to ensure that the foundation program curriculum evolved after the Collins report and other reviews in order to try and make the assessment relevant to the development of foundation program doctors, to satisfy our regulators and indeed the public that our foundation doctors are at the standard we want them to be as they leave the program, but without making the assessment too much of a burden for foundation doctors and faculty. So now looking at how, which is perhaps one of the most important bits, the 2021 foundation program curriculum states that there's 3 different settings in which the foundation program doctors are expected to learn. Experiential learning is very deliberately at the top, whereby working as a doctor in a variety of different settings and with a variety of different colleagues, they will develop their clinical skills as well as developing as a professional. Direct training consisting of core teaching and non-core teaching, which was originally conceptualized as being in a classroom setting, but particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, has now increasingly evolved to being done in a virtual setting as well. And then very, very importantly, self-development. This has become a term that's used mainly about self-development time, but this self-development that foundation doctors carry out and develop their own skills through reflection about what they've done and seen, and reflecting upon their own different career options, what they might want to do and why they would be particularly suited about to do that specialty. So this was a rather rapid journey through the evolution of the foundation program, but I put these examples up to demonstrate how much we've developed our thinking about the foundation program, the way doctors learn, how much it's changed. And I'm sure that future iterations and versions of the foundation program curriculum will continue with this type of development. I'd now like just to say a few words about the UKFPO. The team works across all 4 nations in the UK with input from lots of stakeholders, including foundation schools and postgraduate deans, the General Medical Council, the Medical Schools Council and their medical school constituents, the British Medical Association, and lots of others. As Tom has described, the UKFPO is purely seen by many people in terms of the recruitment and allocation processes, but we are responsible for the implementation of the curriculum. I've talked about how the curriculum's developed. It's written by the Academy of Medical Royal College's Foundation Programme Committee, which is very ably chaired by Dr. Fiona Cameron, who is also Foundation School Director in Scotland, and has had also some very able predecessors. As part of our work implementing that curriculum, ARCPs are designed to ensure that the end of programme assessment of foundation doctors is as fair and as consistent across the country as we can possibly make it. We're responsible for the development and maintenance of the Horus e-portfolio in England and work with our colleagues in NHS Education Scotland, who are responsible for the Turas e-portfolio used in other nations, including Malta, where there is a foundation school affiliated to the UKFPO. Again, we have to ensure consistency for all foundation doctors so that they all have the same opportunities to use their e-portfolio, not just to show they have acquired the minimum standard, but also for them to show off their achievements. We work with the Medical Schools Council and the British Pharmacological Society on the prescribing safety assessment, which is a key test that all foundation doctors must complete by the end of their F1 year on the very important topic of prescribing. The UKFPO works with lots of different stakeholders and is represented on many different with many different bodies, as shown here. Now, as well as the opinions of senior doctors, we're very keen to ensure that the voices of foundation programme doctors are heard as much as possible, albeit that there are nearly 20,000 of them. We have 2 UKFPO fellows appointed every year, shown here speaking at one of our events. These are excellent F2 doctors who apply and are appointed through a very competitive appointment process, and are then funded for a day a week during their F2 year to work with us on projects relevant to the foundation programme, but also to represent their fellow foundation programme doctors. You can see an example of one of the fellows' projects here, the Humans of the Foundation Programme, started by Jeff A. Lau. And if you use that QR code, that will take you to an ebook which shows some of the creative writing, poems and reflections that foundation doctors wrote over the last 12 months. Our fellows chair regular meetings of the Foundation Doctor Advisory Board, which has representatives from every foundation school who feed back to the UKFPO about what's going on locally so that we can look for patterns to try and improve foundation programme training. We put on lots of webinars like the one this evening. These are all on our website and our YouTube channel. providing examples of good practice and learning about non-clinical topics. And we work with a variety of different stakeholders to put these webinars on. So in the next few months, there's going to be webinars with the GMC about GP training and about using ePortfolio. The National Foundation Doctors Presentation Day was started over a decade ago by colleagues in the Severn Foundation School and is now hosted by the UKFPO. These are pictures taken from the event held in January in Sheffield. This is where foundation doctors submit abstracts about work they have done during their programme, and we select the best quality improvement projects, case reports and research to come and present that excellent work. It's a great opportunity to show off the brilliant stuff that they've done during the foundation programme, as well as getting important points for future specialty applications. And I'm always hugely impressed by the quality of the presentations and the projects that they've carried out. I hope that some of you will be able to join us at the next National Foundation Programme, National Foundation Doctor Presentation Day, which will be in Southampton on January 23rd, 2026. I'm now going to finish with a few reflections on where the foundation programme might go from here. Of course, there are always challenges in running such a huge programme, which makes up approximately 25% of postgraduate medical education in the UK. As medical students' numbers increase in the UK, we have to try and find foundation programmes for them all. And Tom has already illustrated nearly a 50% increase in the number of UK medical students since we started in 2005. We have a large number of applicants, as already mentioned, to the foundation programme from overseas, which shows that postgraduate medical training in the UK remains highly desirable. But it's not difficult to understand how difficult it is to start working in a healthcare system that you've never worked in before, possibly in a language which isn't your first language, where many of the idiosyncrasies of the NHS and the colloquialisms that we use as doctors are not immediately accessible. So we have tried to put in more support for people coming from overseas, but that's definitely a work in progress. We have to remain relevant by trying to keep up with all the advances in medical care, while at the same time keeping in mind the purpose of the foundation programme as a broad-based generalist programme. If I reflect on just how much medicine has advanced in my 33 years as a doctor, what I was doing as a PARHO would now just not be recognisable by our current F1s. We have to acknowledge that the values and behaviours of our foundation doctors may be different from their supervisors, as they're likely to come from different generations. Neither generation is right and neither is wrong, but we have to understand that we may need to think differently in terms of how our foundation doctors may learn. And that's without the challenges of artificial intelligence, which will pose great challenges to as it will affect how doctors learn, reflect, and are assessed. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention the financial challenges that we have in healthcare in this country, which are nothing new, but are often reflected in the resources available for postgraduate medical education. And the foundation programme is not immune from that. But I'm going to finish on an optimistic note. When Modernising Medical Careers was implemented, with the foundation programme being part of that, as we discussed earlier, many senior colleagues at the time, and I was a fairly new consultant, but many senior colleagues predicted that the doctors produced in the early parts of the 21st century would not be as good as their predecessors. However, my experience is that in my clinical work, I work with foundation doctors on a daily basis. And in my UKFPO work, I speak to them all the time, as well as seeing that the work they do at such events as the National Foundation Doctors Presentation Day. I have continued to be really impressed by the foundation doctors throughout the 20 years of the foundation programme, and that's exactly the same in 2025. And in seeing the skills that they've developed during the programme in communication, teamwork, leadership, their clinical skills, their use of IT and social media, I firmly believe that our profession is still in really good hands, which is a good job as I get older. I hope that was enjoyable. I hope it was stimulating. I hope it's helped you, some of the older members of the audience, to reflect on their experiences of the foundation program, and have given foundation doctors the opportunity to reflect on how the foundation program has evolved and why it is really where it is now. So a question that's come up is how do we see the future of the foundation program to meet the changing needs of the population? Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we have to. I think there's a lot of discussion about the current model of delivery, and I think most foundation programs are 6 4-month program posts across a range of specialties, both in primary care and secondary care. I think we may need to look at the balance of that in a generalist training program, and how people how people learn on the job. You mentioned the value of experiential learning. I think that will need to be reviewed, how we deliver experiential learning and the reflection one gets from it with the ever-changing needs. Yourself, Mike?
Well, I think, Tom, that what we need to always be thinking about, what is the role of the doctor, because that changes all the time, and as how can I put it, experienced consultants, the role of senior doctors and doctors in training will continue to change as medicine changes and continues to evolve. Nonetheless, I think what is really valuable to patients is a broad base of medical knowledge, an understanding that many patients have comorbidities, have multiple morbidities, and an understanding that medicine is complex, and the use of doctors in particular is about managing uncertainty. And I think that's something that continues to be emphasised in the foundation programme curriculum, and I'm sure will continue to be so in years to come. We've got a question from Morwenna, who's kindly joined us from Scotland. The National Foundation Programme presentation day, is that only for England? Absolutely not. You're very more than welcome to submit work that you've done in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, or Malta. Anything that you've done in the foundation programme, so it could be QI work, it could be a case report, an interesting case that you've seen, or research indeed, if you've been in an SFP post or any other post, and you can submit that. The abstract submission window will open in a couple of weeks' time. All the details are on the UKFPO website, but please submit your work, and I look forward to seeing that. Well, I'd really like to thank the UKFPO team for their, as usual, fantastic work behind the scenes in setting up this webinar. I'd really like to thank Tom for his time and his thoughts about allocation. I'd like to thank you all for coming, or indeed for watching this if you're watching it at a later date on YouTube. I hope it was of great interest. Keep an eye out on the UKFPO website for future webinars, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks very much. Good evening.